We're live. Here we
Hey.
are. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another AES edition of the Eventide Quarantide. Thanks very much to our host, Eventide, for being willing to host this. There's a lot of back office stuff that has to happen to make this work. We're really appreciative. It lets the AES be the AES even during a quarantine. We have a special treat today because if you don't happen to be a student of Mark Rubel's, you may not get to hear him speak and hold forth as he will today, um, unless you've attended one of his many AES events. He presents very often at AES international conventions and at local events and so on. But for today's AES edition of the Eventide live stream, we're going to bring to you what you could see at a typical AES event, which is wise and witty Mark Rubel talking about some aspect of recording arts and music. And today he's so wise and knows so much about it. We've had to constrain him, and we're going to try to limit him to Memphis only. Do you think can you handle those handcuffs, Mark?
I'll do my best.
Good.
Thanks for having me on. And thanks for doing this. This is really great. And I think very informative and helpful to a lot of people. So thank you for representing the AES, and thanks to Eventide for having us.
Well, John and I are looking forward to it because today we get to be one of your students, which will be fun. I want to talk about Memphis, the city, and the river, and why this stuff matters. But I wonder first if you could set the scene. Um, when Elvis is recording one of his early tunes or even one of his early hits, we may not be picturing the right sort of space or the right version of Pro Tools. So we don't need gear trivia, but can you just sort of lay out how records like then were made? How many days did they spend mixing versus doing kazoo overdubs?
Well, it was a minimalistic real-time process. So the background behind you is the interior of Sun Records, which is not actually called Sun Records. Everybody thinks it is Sun Studio. It's the Memphis recording service. That was the name of the studio. Sam Phillips' label was Sun, which he started in '52. Um, the scene is a 17 by 30-foot room with vaulted ceilings, uh, usually no baffles, uh, and everybody set up in one room. There was a grand total of 4 microphones typically, and Sam was in a small control room, elevated so that he would be at eye level with the artists, which is very important because he was, trying to work with them psychologically to get the very best out of them. How much time would they spend doing overdubs and mixing? None. It was all done in actual real time. The players would play, the microphones would capture what happened, he would blend it as it happened, and record it live to mono, either to a lathe, where it's committed to what we call acetate, which is in fact lacquer, and or to a mono tape machine. No remixing, no overdubbing, rarely even any editing where they go, combined takes. It all, he was capturing lightning in a bottle, and he was trying to capture do the best of what a recording engineer can do, which is to capture a moment in time and space.
So it's entirely live to mono, and it's just, did you say 4 or 5 mics? It's minimalist mics. The only close mic might be the vocal mic, and they're getting a blend in the room.
Absolutely. So again, no isolation. So when you have 4 microphones or 5, they, if there's a drum set in the room, every mic is a drum mic. And, he did use ribbon mics. We had RCA44 and RCA77. And as people probably know, the dead side of a ribbon microphone is the deadest side of any microphone. So he could use that to control the leakage somewhat, but he did what we highly encourage people to do, which is to record live and make leakage your friend, and use the sound of people in a room to convey the feeling of people in a room.
And so that the null that a bidirectional microphone has, that a true bidirectional has, like a ribbon microphone, that's almost as important as the on-axis sound quality of the microphone itself when you're making a record like this.
Very much so. Also, the fact that ribbon microphones have great off-axis response. In other words, when you're close miking one thing at a time in an isolated room, all you care about is what's in front of the microphone. But when you have everybody in the room and every mic is picking up everyone there, because it's got acoustic tile on the walls, but it's not anechoic. It has a tile floor. So It's important that what the microphones are picking up of the other players sounds good, and that's one of the great advantages of ribbon microphones, unlike other types like dynamics and condensers.
Mark, were they only using ribbon microphones, or were they mixing in some
It,
moving coil microphones or some condenser microphones?
it was a mix. There was the typical setup was one RC44 bidirectional ribbon, one RC77DX, which is a switchable pattern ribbon, so you could make it cardioid if you wanted to, and then typically a Shure 55 dynamic mic, which of course we now call the Elvis mic because that's what Sam had and what he put on Elvis, and we, as you see, in front of Alex. Also, he had a condenser microphone. It was an Altec M11, also known as a 21, which we call the Coke bottle mic. I have one here. It's shaped like like a Coke bottle, sort of. It's a black vacuum tube condenser microphone. Some of them had glass diaphragms, which is unusual. And you'll see other mics occasionally. He had what we call an Altec 666, which is a 666, the microphone of the beast, which is a sort of military green looking, Electro Voice, not Altec, Electro Voice microphone, 666, which you'll see in pictures of James Brown and other people. We still use them. I mean, I still use mine on bass drums and things like that once in a while.
It seems like the sort of mic that Slipknot should use.
Yeah, it's kind of strange looking. It has this long kind of a fin on top of it, so it looks fairly 50s. But that's for the rear entry port. It's really an early, what we call variable D microphone. So it's like an early version of an RE20 or something that is, its directionality keeps it, the variable D design allows it to stay pretty directional even to low frequencies. And again, when you've got everybody set up in the room, that makes a difference.
When I look at Sun Studios, like the screen behind me, I wonder about the acoustics. It does seem like a consultant in acoustics wasn't necessarily hired for this gig, but some thought was given. We see bumpiness and we see absorptive tiles for at least mid and especially high frequencies. Do you know, was the acoustics kind of lucky or trial and error, or they really knew something about the science, or it didn't matter? I sort of want to connect it to what we all face, which is we're more and more recording at home or in other spaces. And a little bit when I look at Sun, I think, maybe a living room will work if I'm clever.
Absolutely. To answer your question, it was a combination of all the factors that you mentioned. So Sam was in touch with other people who knew about acoustics, notably Bill Putnam Sr., who had Universal Audio in Chicago and did Sam's mastering, and later started UREI and United Western and so forth. So it wouldn't surprise me if he got help from him. He was also later in contact with a guy named Jack Wiener, who was sort of an overlooked figure in the history of recording. He's the guy that designed Chess Studios, and he later custom built Sam's consoles. So he had some help, but he really did it himself. It was he and his assistant Marion Keisker. He was on a shoestring budget. He rented this radiator shop for $80 a month, and they just got the standard acoustic tiles and put them up. And trial and error was also part of it, which is he knew what to listen for. He was an experienced recording engineer and broadcast engineer, and so he would walk around and clap his hands, and then they'd put up some more tiles, and then he'd try something out. I've recorded in that room, and it's amazing. You don't need headphones in there. You can hear everything that's going on. And to your point of, can you make a great recording in a living room? Of course, many people have. If you think of the band doing their second record in Sammy Davis Jr.'s Pool House, for example. But it's also recursive in this case, because the room that you're virtually sitting in front of is where that sound came from. And what I like to say about it is that the sound of American vernacular architecture, the sound of a typical size and shaped American storefront brick building, became the sound of American music. And now when we make records, we're actually chasing that sound. So it actually created the thing that we're going for.
Mark, I notice in the picture behind me there it looks to be a curtain. Is that something that could be uh, you know, uh, opened up and closed to change the acoustic?
Absolutely. Yeah, they were trying to control it a bit. That's the west wall of Sun. And when in some of the pictures you'll see over on the left, they had to pull the curtains back if they were running the furnace because they didn't want it to catch on fire. Uh, this photo came from the Scotty Moore website, which is a great history of this kind of thing. And just want to mention Terry Manning took a lot of the photos that we'll be showing of other places, and obviously had a lot of help from people who know more about this than I do. Matt Rossbang, who worked in that room for 11 years. But yes, it was somewhat variable, and he was always experimenting to try things. One of the remarkable things is he opened that on the second day of the second half of the 20th century, January 2nd, 1950. And he had the lease for 9 years and then moved to a place that was sort of the opposite of Sun. It was a very expansive palace with, 3 echo chambers and big studios and offices. Sam never had a desk. For example, he did most of his work at Taylor's restaurant next door. Anyway, the amazing thing is that it closed in 1959, and it's basically remained intact. It was empty for a while. It became a scuba shop of all things in Memphis. It became a laundromat. It was a radiator shop, and somehow all the acoustic treatment and the wall and the window and everything are still there. And it's a fantastic museum where they record in the evenings. So I highly encourage anybody who visits Memphis to go there.
I'm sorry. Did the sound of the records change from 1950 to 1959? And was there some reason that some addition of equipment or perfection in the methodology that and maybe an example if people want to listen at home, an example of a record from 1950 to one from 1959, how that might have changed, developed.
Yes, yeah, it did change. Of course, music changed radically from 1950 to 1959, and to a very large extent because of what happened in that room. So, when Sam moved in and started the Memphis Recording Service, as I said, he had been a broadcast engineer broadcasting big bands from the hotel ballroom, the rooftop ballroom of the Peabody Hotel. And so he really knew about microphone technique and the kind of thing you have to do to make a viable recording out of 4 microphones in a mono recording. When he started the places, their motto was, "We record anything, anywhere, anytime." He would literally would record speeches and funerals and bar mitzvahs and what have you. But one of his real reasons for starting it is he didn't like this smooth big band music. He wanted to record the exciting African-American music that he had learned about growing up from a guy who worked on his family farm in Florence, Alabama, which is another whole story when you think that he and W.C. Handy, the king of the blues, came from Florence, Alabama. So it's the father of rock and roll, the king of the blues, and all the music that went on in that area, Muscle Shoals, which is a whole other story. Yes, it changed more because of the music than because of the recording techniques. He had the same console in 1959 that he had in 1950. He pretty much had the same microphones. The main addition was that he got some tape machines. And not because he was going to go multi-track, because he had one to record onto and one to add echo with. So, but in the early days, he was recording mainly African-American people, Howlin' Wolf, B.B. King, Roscoe Gordon with his dancing chicken, Butch, rooster. By the way, Roscoe and Butch would dress in matching outfits, and Butch the rooster would drink whiskey and dance on the piano while Roscoe played.
This is really good to know. Thanks for telling us that, Mark.
I think that'll be very useful for everybody in there.
Chicken and the rooster wore matching outfits. Okay.
So, originally he was recording that kind of music, and you have to keep in mind that in 1950, Memphis was a completely segregated town. There were separate water fountains, there were separate days at the zoo, there were separate barbershops and hotels, and a black person couldn't go into restaurants or, to restaurants that they weren't allowed in and so forth. So for Sam to be dedicating himself and to leave this world of radio broadcasting behind to open up a place in a little radiator shop, which, here's another piece of trivia for you. Before, it was a place called the Magic Throttle Company, which I just like the name of. Anyway, that was amazing. It wasn't that there wasn't, rhythm and blues and that sort of thing. But he really, brought a lot of interesting music and people to light.
Is there something about the style of early rock and roll that lent itself to this system of recording?
Yes, in many ways. So one, it's all about interaction and energy and excitement in real time. You're not going to get the thrill of the early Elvis stuff or the Carl Perkins or Jerry Lee Lewis. You're never going to get that through overdubbing. And you're never going to get that magic and the excitement that reaches through the decades and grabs you by the throat every time you listen to it by programming. How long would it take you to program a Little Richard record? And would it ever feel like anything? No. This was something, if we hear a whole lot of shaking going on and it takes whatever it is, 3 minutes, it took 3 minutes to make that record. And I think that's something that everybody can learn from, just because we have the ability to record everything separately, because we have the ability to tune everything and move everything and overdub everything and theoretically perfect it and round off all the edges, doesn't mean that we have to. The average person in their laptop or in their DAW has 100,000 times more processing than Sam had. And what he had wasn't magical. It was broadcast equipment. It was cast off radio gear, which accounts for all the distortion on the Howlin' Wolf record. That thing, the RCA console he was using was a broadcast console from a radio station, and it was made to handle a FM, radio announcer crooning into it and playing records. And it wasn't meant to have Howlin' Wolf screaming into it, So one of the features of that is distortion. And distortion is excitement, because we're trying to get through this little wire. We're trying to get the visceral feel of that music. And, that's one of the things that, just if you want to talk about psychoacoustics for a second, when our ears create harmonic distortion, that means something is loud. When something is loud, it means that something is happening. What happens? Our adrenaline goes up and we get a fight or flight response. So we can manipulate that a little bit by adding distortion to things and creating a similar response. So, what happened? Well, everything happened. And most of it happened in that room, right? Elvis, which was, the big bang of rock and roll, and before that, what many people point to, it's a great point of argument, but, really the first rock and roll record one of the first was made there in 1951. Theoretically, Jackie Branston and his Delta Cats, actually probably Ike Turner and the Kings of Rhythm. Fuzzy, distorted guitar. Why? The guitar fell off the roof, the amp fell off the roof of the car. It was broken. He didn't have a spare. They stuffed it with newspaper. It's all fuzzy and buzzy. It's the sound, as Brian Eno would say, of things breaking. And the sound of perfection isn't all that exciting. And so, so it was that. What changed technically? Not that much.
Could I just jump in here? So I know you would never advocate for ignoring technology and ignoring the opportunities we have today. We're not trying to fetishize a certain time of record making, but it's more that maybe in your 96 track production, you have to record a section, a horn section, or some sort of section where you might want interactivity. So you could, for a small part of your contemporary multi-track production, you might want to tie your hands a little bit, record them live with fewer microphones, tickle some distortion to get some of the sound, right? So we can borrow bits and pieces of this. We don't have to borrow the entire workflow when we think about making records today.
True. And then again, we can if we want to. So, if you have a DAW that's capable of doing all that, you also have a machine that's capable of recording a drum set with one microphone or an entire band with 4. And if you have a living room or a garage, you have a room about it's just a big living room. You have a room about the size and shape of sun. So it's a funny thing how air is a great mixer. And that's one of the things about that room. And it was probably accidental. It was probably what he could afford. But that size of room is not a stuffy booth, but it's also not a big echoing, theater or whatever. So there's a certain thing that Jim Dickinson, who was one of the great Memphis characters, said about that room, which is that the air was a compressor. That size of room, if you get a band that's playing loud, it blends everything together. So again, if you're recording at home, if you've got a horn section, you've got a bunch of background singers, then it's perfectly fine to put everybody around one microphone or to put everybody in the room. And I think that really we can learn from the philosophy of Sam Phillips as much as from his individual techniques. And his philosophy was, capture something that had some life in it, and leave the rough edges. And so I think it's a good lesson to that we can be minimalist if we want to be, and let things go.
Mark, is there could you describe some of the ways that Sam Phillips would manipulate time, create acoustic or mechanical time processing?
Certainly. So he didn't have room for an echo chamber, meaning a dedicated echo chamber. He did have, behind Alex to the left is the door to Marion's office, which was interesting because that building is on a diagonal corner. So her office actually has non-parallel walls, and occasionally he would put mics up there, so you could get a more distant recording if you wanted to. He didn't have an echo chamber as some studios did. So what he used was tape slap. And so he eventually got an Ampex mono tape machine. There's Marion Keister on the right. He got a mono tape machine and would send signals to that to be delayed. In other words, you have the tape running, you record, you set it to reproduce. So the sound gets recorded on the record head. Depending on the tape speed, there's a delay until it gets to the playhead, and then it plays back. If you, on his Ampex machine, my calculation is at 7.5 inches per second, it's 266 milliseconds. And at 15 IPS, which was the top speed, it's 133 milliseconds. So, those would be the two classic rockabilly slap echoes.
And we should point out that's not a mix move. That tape slap was also happening live when they were recording live to mono.
It was recording live to mono, yes. And again, to speak in minimalism, he had a broadcast console. It had 6 volume knobs, so 4 microphones, the slap, and probably a talkback. No EQ, right? He had 1 compressor that he built from a kit to compress the entire mix. And the other question is, how did he derive echo if it's a broadcast console? You don't have echo sends on a broadcast console, right? So how did he do it? He had a separate microphone that was dedicated to echo. That was the echo, you could call it the echo send, that went directly to the mic input of the Ampex, right? The Ampex is in playback. It comes back on the 5th or 6th channel, and he blended in. And then how would he decide what had echo on? He moved the microphone around. If you wanted more in vocals, you put it more in front of the vocalist. If you wanted it on guitar, also you put it between the guitar and vocal. So again, he was using air as a blender, which is an incredible mixer.
Did they have a separate engineer operating the tape machine?
No. Not that I know of. Usually I think it was just Sam, who, let it be said, was a wild man and a visionary, but I would say a pragmatic visionary. I mean, somebody who did want to help popularize the music that came from Beale Street, which we call Black America's Main Street. It was very unusual that you had an entire entertainment district that was African American. He wanted to do that. He wanted to bring that music into the mainstream with somebody like Elvis, who he looked for a long time. And also, when he had a larger staff, most of his staff were women. And he started 2 radio stations that were entirely staffed by women, engineers, office staff, on-air talent, and all that sort of thing. So he was a visionary, and he did move to make the world a better place. But when I say pragmatic visionary, he also was trying to make money and ended up changing the world in the process.
So I hear that he, in some cases, I hear that he gets credit for inventing tape delay. But then I don't know whether that's true or not. What do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm not sure either. There was some use of tape delay previous to that in radio stations for profanity delay. So you could record on one machine and then do sort of like the Frippertronics Brian Eno thing, where you record on one machine that goes through a bunch of rollers and whatever mic stands, and then plays back on another machine. And that way, if somebody says something on your call-in show that you might want to delete, you have 6 to 8 seconds to get to the mute switch. The short answer is I don't know. It's certainly the most prominent and early version of it. And if you listen to something like Mystery Train, which is a fascinating recording, there's really great evidence of something else that I'm an advocate for in recording, which is what I call active mixing. He didn't set the levels and then just sit there while they recorded. He would bring people up and down. And when you listen to Mystery Train, there are places where the echo jumps up and places where it gets much quieter. You can hear him behind the controls, and you can hear that, he was a live wire, and he was the conduit through which all of that great art and music has come to us and will live forever. Some of that stuff is on the Voyager aircraft in interstellar space. It will outlive the human race, quite literally.
Wow. So it's really interesting. He's kind of a force as a business person, as a producer and recordist, as an advocate for African-American music, and having an all-female run radio station. He sounds like he was way ahead of his time. And we also know, by the way, we're kind of skipping over it, some of these things cost him dearly. He had some dramatic business failures trying to get traction with some of these ideas, and he persevered through all that somehow. It's really inspiring.
No, he was a force of nature, and he was driven. He was driven to do the things that he did and to prove himself, and to, he didn't move to New York, he didn't move to Los Angeles. He made it all happen from this river town, which happened to just be in the right place to be, one of the great well springs of culture. If you think about rock and roll, rock and roll, jazz, and I would argue Looney Tunes are some of the great cultural contributions of the U.S. to the world. They're uniquely American. And really, it's probably a stretch to say that he invented it, but the world, not just music, he didn't change just music, he changed the world. Because when you think of what the things that happened in that room went on to create influence, which would be the Beatles, if you think about all the Carl Perkins songs that they did, and the influence that had on them, all the influence that Elvis and Jerry Lee and everybody else has had, the fact that people are still making that kind of music, it changed more than music. It changed the world. It changed politics. It changed culture. It changed filmmaking. It changed art.
So more about Memphis itself. We didn't quite get to, that would be the logical place to start. Is there more to this place and the time that makes this possible that you can elaborate on, that goes beyond Sam Phillips?
Well, so much. I mean, before it goes back, of course, to its roots as an agricultural town, and the Civil War, and actually the yellow fever epidemics of the late 19th century, where a large percentage of the city actually either left or died. And most of the people who were left were African Americans because they couldn't leave, and many, it turned out, more were immune. So it became a very African American centric place. And actually lost its charter as a city for something like 15 years because the population was so diminished. So that's the continuity that he came from. And of course, he was surrounded by other fascinating characters and wild people, Dewey Phillips, the great wrestler Sputnik Monroe, which you should look up, and so forth. And then, after that, I mean, that Memphis is where the civil rights battle was fought, one of the places, and it's where Martin Luther King was assassinated. And it's where Elvis died, and it's where Jeff Buckley drowned in the Mississippi River. I call it a haunted city. It's there's just this whole confluence of energy in that place that you can feel. It's, America has become a very genericized place. You go to any city and you see the same restaurants and stores, and everything pretty much looks the same, and it's all predictable. But think about how different America was in 1950, where you didn't have superhighways, and it was a unique. Well, every place was unique then, but it's maintained somehow its unique feel. But unique cuisine and unique local music and so forth. Regionalized music is something that we don't really have as much anymore.
And that's all documented in the music and the sound recordings that we can hear today to sort of relive those flavors and that time and that feeling, which could also inspire us today as artists. I want to loop back. We're talking about really big picture issues, so I want to talk about acoustics.
Sure.
I want to loop back to the room that's behind me. Recent history showed us that Billie Eilish could sing Grammy-winning vocals in a bedroom. And in part that works, well, of course, first it works because of the songs and the performance, but also in part because they didn't overplay the space or over energize the space. And there's something to the arrangement of an Elvis record that isn't the loud wall of guitars. And I wonder if you could just sort of speak to how loud were the drums and what did that make possible for miking techniques? Because today, if we're going to again record in a space that's originally for selling radiators, or it's our living room, we may not be able to play the typical power rock arrangement.
Absolutely. Well, that it it almost seems obvious at this point that the people are going to blend and balance better if they're actually playing in a room together in real time, and that they can't do things like overpower the room by blasting away. That's a fairly recent development if you think of the history of recording. That it wasn't until, let's say, the 70s when you had more multi-track tape machines, so you isolate people more into different rooms, and then you'd have a headphone system, and people would be able to play as loud as they wanted and figure, oh, the engineer is going to balance it. But in the time of something like an Elvis recording or a recording RCA in any of the RCA studios, so forth, if you look at the footage of a Frank Sinatra session, he's standing in front of a full orchestra and band with, by the way, bleachers full of observers, which is so funny. But if the drummer plays so loud that they overshadow that they're drowning out the singer in that room, they're just plain fired. So, they were playing with light sticks and they were playing lightly. And it's a beautiful thing that it gives more control to the musicians, and it helps them to balance themselves. So just the fact of being able to record without headphones is obviously something that we can do anywhere. And that allows the musicians to balance themselves. So if it's time for somebody's solo, they can not only respond to it in real time, but they can lay back and then step forward and play louder. And there's a fundamental difference between the sound of somebody playing at a single dynamic and being turned up and down, as opposed to the sound of somebody playing more softly and the sound of them pushing. So, and one of the other things about those Elvis recordings is they're minimal. It's often, there aren't even any drums. It's acoustic slap bass and guitar and vocal in many cases. So it wasn't filled up with an orchestra or a choir. So that happened later, to Elvis. But it's one of the things about having space in it is that they left space in the arrangement of the recording.
And that guitar, by the way, was often acoustic guitar, right?
And the bass is often acoustic bass, which is a fundamental change. Even though the electric bass came in 1951, the sound of an acoustic bass is altogether different. And of course, the sound of a slap bass, where you're slapping it, is a whole other thing.
Where the slap provides the backbeat.
Yep.
Do you know anything about drum mic placement or the placement for bass to get those sorts of sounds? Because we shouldn't take our contemporary close mic everything approach if we're trying to get this feeling. If the band's blending in the room and they're playing at a reasonable dynamic so that they can comfortably hear each other, we should also be miking in different ways.
I agree. And, that was, for example, at Chess, that was the technique, which is they had everybody in the room. They had a vocal mic the singer would sing, everybody would play, and then they would just figure out what wasn't being picked up enough by vocal mic and reinforce that. So but paradoxically, with the Sun drum miking, it was actually the opposite of what you would think now, where now you think, oh, everything's close mic, but in those days they were more distant. The drums, partly because the drummers weren't flailing, often the drum, there was one drum microphone, and it was like right in front of the drummer's nose or forehead. It was pretty low, like basically right above the cymbals, and sometimes even lower. What mic, it varies. I've seen pictures of the 666 electro voice and so on. But so that's something that's nice to be able to do. But because of the way that drummers play now, I guess it's you could think of it as a sort of a funny psychological limiter. If you put a microphone there and they're scared of hitting it, it'll make them play more quietly. But we're not really there to interfere with their performance. As far as a string bass, as far as I know, I think they would experiment with different things, and eventually other engineers came in. But as far as I can tell, it's typically a ribbon mic down fairly low by the belly of the instrument, and but high enough to the slapping sound can be pretty overwhelming. So there, you could kind of raise and lower it to balance between the body of the note and the percussive part in between.
The low mono overhead mic, I learned from Ringo, and when I've tried it, it's always refreshing if the drummer's playing the right sort of part, as you described. It's a really great view of the drum kit, and it's fun to learn that it predates anything Abbey Road was doing, that it was part of what was going on at Sun and elsewhere.
Certainly, and one of the keys to all the recordings that we're going to talk about is that what's the key to getting a great record? Great musicians and great song. That's always been the case. And so how would you balance it if you only have one microphone for the drums? You play the record back to the musicians, and the drummer goes, oh, my rack tom's a little bit loud, and on the next take, it's magically fixed. So, there's a kind of a basic philosophical question there, which is, should it really be up to the engineer as all-controlling, all-powerful entity to control how loud people are, what their balance and blend is, and do the musicians really want to leave that up to us? I mean, we're happy to do the best we can, but I think the whole business with Sam is the more, his was entirely a front-loaded process. The more you can get in real time, the less time there is for double thinking or rethinking or obsession, which now mixing is pushing pushing the hi-hat up and down to just decibel and a half for an hour and a half. It's easy to miss the point of why you're making the record, and if you know what you're trying to do, it makes it easier to figure out what to do. And I think he had a very clear image in his head, a very clear vision of what he was trying to communicate and how to get it across. And amazing, Mark, it still works. It's 60 years later.
What were the can you in the control room? Were there headphones in the control room? Was it just one mono speaker, and what kind of speaker?
Single mono speaker over the window, and I don't know, but I think it was some kind of an RCA speaker. They have one in there now that's not the original, but I think it was some sort of a mono speaker. That console has a built-in 8-watt power amplifier and a headphone jack. I've never seen pictures of him with headphones on, so I think they were doing that, and they would have a playback speaker in the studio, so you didn't, the control room was fairly tiny, so everybody didn't have to put their instruments down and lose their vibe. You could play it, and Sam knew, above all, was a kind of master psychologist, and he knew how to push people's buttons and what to say, and when it felt right and when it didn't, and he would do whatever he had to try and motivate and get out of people, what was unique to them. And that's another thing about this early recording. He was using relatively available equipment, but a lot of people were using custom-built things they made themselves. He had this compressor made themselves. It was really about individualism. And it's funny now that we have all the tools in the world that things are more generic than they were then.
Well, can we fast forward to Suspicious Minds, where
Let's do.
the studio changes and the workflow changes, the capabilities change, the resulting aesthetic is very different. I do want to get to Al Green, but let's linger on Elvis a little bit longer. I wonder if you can just sort of compare and contrast a little bit what happens when we get to the really wide, lush Suspicious Minds track.
Absolutely. So Elvis burst onto the scene in 1954. And Sam sold his contract RC in 55. So that was a fairly brief supernova. And then he embarked on the rest of his career. He got drafted the following year and then made a series of ill-advised movies with insipid songs and music, recording in the RCA studios. And
I love those movies.
well, there you go.
John doesn't know they're ill-advised movies.
Just because they're ill-advised doesn't mean they're bad. And made some great records too, in especially in the Nashville studios, RCA studios, and elsewhere. But he hadn't recorded in Memphis since the famous $1 Million Quartet that happened at Sun, where they got Johnny Cash, Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Carl Perkins just basically having a jam session. Of course, Sam or Jack Clemens roll tape. Anyway, he hadn't been there except for that since 1955. 1968, he has his comeback special, and they go to this studio, American Sound Studio, which is started by a very interesting guy named Chips Moman. Real name, Lincoln Wayne Chips Moman. Chips because he was a poker player, and he was the original engineer at Stax, and which is a whole other story. Great guitar player, great songwriter, another character, and had put the studio together. This would be what we're seeing here, pretty close to the setup that they would have had in 1968 or 69. This came from the Facebook page of American Studios, which is quite interesting. So Elvis comes back to Memphis. They cut 16 songs in 10 days. And one of them is Suspicious Minds. They later overdubbed his road backup singers. There are 11 backup singers. Actually, there are 13 backup singers on this song, Suspicious Minds. Originally, it was Jeannie Green, who was from Muscle Shoals and who sort of features in all sorts of amazing things, including the concert of Bangladesh. And believe it or not, Ronnie Milsap as the other original. And then they put 11 people on there, including, I think, the Sweet Inspirations, at least Cissy Houston, who was the mother of Whitney Houston and the aunt of Dee Dee and Dionne Warwick singing on. Okay, so they recorded in Memphis, and the band is what we call the Memphis Boys, which was, something else that was really different about that time is that studios had rhythm sections. They had a group of musicians who were fast, versatile, sensitive, creative, brilliant musicians. So they got those people, Reggie Young, amazing guitar player, a guy named Mike Leach, who's an incredible bass player. I think that's his bass that Elvis is holding. And so forth, Gene Christman on drums. And incredible players who played on all sorts of things. Dobie Gray's Drift Away. They played on Dusty in Memphis, a great record, Dusty Springfield. They played on Neil Diamond, Sweet Caroline, and all these Elvis songs. Just a ton of stuff. B.J. Thomas. The basic track for Suspicious Minds was cut. I have it written down. On January 23rd, 1969, between 4 and 7 a.m., to give you an idea of Elvis's work habits. So they'd be there, whatever, drinking, playing cards, working on stuff. It was 8 takes. And that's a later, behind John is a later control room. That's an Electrodyne console. But at the time, they had a Universal Audio 610 board, mixing board. It's all vacuum tube, designed again by Bill Putnam. Actually, the first console that I had in my very first studio in 1980 in Champaign, Illinois, had a similar board, a 12-channel version that we bought from Bill. An 8-track Scully, which is not quite in the picture. And then you can see there's a couple of Ampex 4 tracks, including what appears to be an MR70. I just realized that, which is a very famous, supposed to be the best, one of the best sounding tape machines ever made. Anyhow, keep in mind.
This is a multi-track production then. This is not live to mono or
It
live
is
to two.
It's a multi-track production, but keep in mind it's 8 tracks. You've got organ, guitar, drums, bass, backup singers, Elvis singing. There's an example of the low overhead, by the way, with a U47. That's a little risky. Electric guitar. So there's an awful lot on there. And Elvis singing his own harmony vocals, right? It's almost like a duet. That's a lot to fit on 8 tracks. And what does that mean? Something else that I encourage people to do, which is you have to make decisions early on. It's not quite like Sam Phillips, where you had to make all the decisions in real time and you could never go back. But still, when you have that many people on 8 tracks, that takes some work. It's also stereo. The final mix is stereo, and I would say very wide stereo. You have things that are all together in one ear and all together in another ear. And you have an echo chamber. And if we want to talk about how do we make records like this these days, there are many fine reverbs that will do, but we all possess in our space, we all have a bathroom and or garage or stairwell. And if you have a monitor, could even be one of your powered monitors, and a microphone, which presumably you would have, and they don't really have to be great. You could put a speaker in an ambient space and put a microphone somewhere else in it. And it's amazing how real and beautiful and random and chaotic something like that can be, especially if you delay the send to the
delay and EQ the send typically to a chamber. But so just to loop back, Sun Studios, famous as it is, does not have a reverb chamber, right? So all the Sun records rely on tape delay, tape slap, but we don't get chamber on Elvis until something like Suspicious Minds.
Correct. Yeah, and it's interesting because it's when you listen to the mix of Suspicious Minds, the vocals are actually fairly quiet. You'd think it's Elvis and you'd want him really up front, but like the bass guitar is super loud and busy, which is fantastic. It's almost Jameson-like, or the other bass player was Tommy Cogbill, who's this incredibly, probably overlooked. Both these guys, Mike Leach. The bass is really loud. The guitar is really loud. And the vocals are not the kind of like what you get now with a country mix, where the vocals are in your face and everything else is supporting cast. How do they do it? Well, again, I think we want to talk about psychoacoustics. There's chamber on the background vocals and on the lead vocal, and everything else is bone dry. And our hearing in our brains, which is the same thing, we hear with our brains, are able to separate them because they're in different ambient spaces. So it's a little bit less of a naturalistic depiction of an event as you would have with Elvis, where you hear them in the room and you can hear the humidity on the walls and that sort of thing. It's a little bit more fabricated, but still very, just because of the energy that everybody was and the kind of hyped upness of it, and Elvis himself. It's really great. He had something to prove. He'd gone away. He'd had this interim period, which maybe wasn't that great. And he was really out to prove something. He just had his comeback special into the black leather and that sort of thing. And he really did. They cut a bunch of great records in that period. And it was really a great revitalization. It truly was a comeback.
And so the use of chamber is inspiring in a lot of ways. We can all build our own chamber if we have the energy, and in these times where we're kind of confined to one facility, maybe we have the time and energy to do that. But also the aesthetics aren't quite what we're expecting. So if you're thinking, I built a chamber and I'm going to put it on the snare drum, I would encourage you to do some listening to these records, right? Because as you point out, it's on the vocal and the background vocal, but the drum kit is still played at a tolerable live dynamic, blending in the room. We don't go crazy with drums until 1980. So the kit is still kind of small here.
Absolutely. And somehow I don't think I'm a cranky old man, but this is going to sound kind of cranky old manish. It's just odd to me that the process of recording has been inverted. from what I think is the natural order. And this is highly editorialized, but you would start with a song, you would have a singer, the musicians would play with them while they sang and support what they did. And when you got a take that felt right and that didn't have any clunkers, that was it, right? And I feel as though it's a little bit backwards when what people typically do, which is they build a track, they start with the drums and they spend hours on it, then they add this, then they add that, they add instruments, and then the last thing they do is add in the vocals. And somehow the vocalist has to fit into this space and they have to conform to the music. What do people focus on in any kind of human communication? Other humans, right? So in a mix, what are we going to listen for? The singer and the melody and maybe even the lyrics. And it's just sort of odd that to me it seems inverted. So in a case like this, they were all playing to him.
Well, let's jump to Al Green and Royal Studios, because it's another example of a really tight, reverb-free production that is beautifully powerful and also timeless. And we're running out of time, so I don't want to neglect this other sort of aesthetic that can also inform how we listen and how we record today. So I wonder if you could point to Royal Studio and connect it to what came before.
Royal Studio is another great studio. It was built in the early 50s, mid 50s, by alums of Sun Studio. So there's a connection that connects everything there. It's an old movie theater, silent movie theater from 1915 that was called the Shamrock Theater, and then became Royal Theater. One of the things that makes the acoustics great is that it, like Stax, which was also an old movie theater, the ceiling and floor aren't parallel, and so it automatically breaks up resonances. Originally, it was a kind of rockabilly studio, and then they started doing a lot of instrumental hits with the Bill Black combo. Bill Black had been Elvis's bass player. Along comes Willie Mitchell, a great band leader, arranger.
Another force of nature, another
total force of nature. Had sort of the top band in Memphis, leading a 10-piece big band, even when he was in his 20s. And through a series of events, Willie ends up taking over, and because he has sort of basically the best aesthetic and pulse on it. So for a while, people thought that the label was High Records and the studio was Royal. People thought High stood for hit instrumentals, because in the 60s they made all these instrumental hits. Willie's on tour. He's in Midland, Texas. There's an opening band, the Green Brothers. Actually, was whatever. The lead singer was Al Green, who'd had a minor hit. And Willie thinks that he's great, gives him some money to move to Memphis. 6 months later, his doorbell rings. He'd forgotten completely about it. There's a guy there. He thinks he's there to paint the kitchen or something. It's like, it's me, it's Al Green. Oh, okay. So they go to work on trying to perfect his sound and keep him from being as much of like a Sam Cooke impersonator or James Brown impersonator or whatever. Finding his voice, which is what these guys did, finding his unique voice. And in this case, what worked was to have him sing more closely and more quietly. And by now, if you can see behind Alex is the room of Royal, which started out as a fairly typical like 50s, 60s studio, fairly open, linoleum floor and all that sort of thing. Willie did the opposite of what a lot of people did. He kept deadening the room down. So there's open fiberglass insulation, there's burlap, there's felt. It's a very dead room, but it's acoustically dead. But but things still feel energetic in there, right? As you can see, there is a vocal booth, and Al Green would sing on the famous number 9 microphone, is a DX77 RCA. They had numbers on the different microphones, and this just happened to be the one that worked. It wasn't their 9th DX. Anyway, and as you can see, there's a drums kit out there, a B3, and what was the key to it? It was Willie Mitchell's ears, Al Green's amazing talent, and the high rhythm section. So you had the Hodges brothers, who Willie more or less, we call them pops, or they call them pops. He more or less, like, literally adopted them. Some of them lived with him for years until they got married, and partly because he was taking them out and playing in bars when they were underage and he needed legal guardianship. But it was their feel and their taste and the way that he had raised them to be minimalistic and to groove that created this whole vein of incredible soul music, which is what came out of Royal and continues to. That's a modern picture. It's unchanged since 1969, when Willie achieved what we call, or what his son Boo Mitchell calls, the perfected Willie Mitchell sound. Let's Stay Together. It's the room is unchanged. They got it right, and that was what it is.
It's counterintuitive to me that the horn charts are so important to that. So the rhythm section has this beautiful groove, and then the horn charts are often very ambitious and Otis Redding influenced, but they're also really tight. They're really close sounding, and they completely work. They don't need a bunch of reverb on them.
It is really funny. I mean, it's the Memphis horns, so they were on the Otis Redding and the Stax and everything else. I believe it was them. But it is funny because the horns and even the strings, the strings on Let's Stay Together, you'd think if you're going to put reverb on anything, it would be that. So to have a completely dry string section, but one of the themes of this whole thing is, why did these people make the choices that they made? It wasn't out of some kind of a dogma. They had something in mind that they were trying to communicate. If you were to frame what an Al Green record is in a word, I would say intimacy. They're very intimate records. Well, if you put a bunch of reverb on somebody, that means that they're in a big space. They're at a distance. That's ingrained in our understanding of sound, right? And that works for somebody who's proclaiming a song from mountaintop. But if it's somebody talking about love to somebody, it's different when they're here. And that's what he was going for. So it's not that he just goes, for some reason I'm going to deaden all this stuff. He knew what he was going for, and that it created this whole vein of soul music that's up there with Motown and the Philadelphia soul music and Stax and Muscle Shoals and all that.
Was Al Green's voice particularly quiet? And would that have informed the way they mixed his dry sound?
Not so much at the beginning. It was actually Willie had to work with him to get him to pull it back. So I mean, he can belt it out, but I think that's what a producer does, right? Is they derive a vision and a message, and they find they connect with a talent that can get that across. And so
as I understand it, when he found Al Green was singing more in an Otis Redding style. He was trying to belt, and that was a clearly desirable aesthetic. But it took vision to say, hey, Al Green's voice can do this whole other thing, and he can write in this restrained, intimate way. And so it went from something no one had heard before to something that evolved in Royal Studios with Willie Mitchell and Al Green collaborating. It's really an impressive story.
Well, there's a parallel to Sam Phillips and Elvis. I mean, both Elvis and Al Green obviously are incredible talents and incredible skills, but in the case of Pops Mitchell and Sam Phillips, they were looking for a vehicle to communicate the vision that they had. And I should say that when I say Royal is unchanged, literally it's the same as it was. The equipment's different, although what's there has been there for a while. And it is still very much of a vital place, where that's a dedicated recording studio. So parts of Uptown Funk were recorded there. The Wu-Tang Clan $1 Million record was done there. John Mayer Continuum, Snoop Dogg, Robert Plant, Phil Collins, lots of people have recorded there. So it's still an ongoing concern. They're making great records. The technology that they used for the Al Green record is kind of interesting. That Pops got a new 8-track machine when they became available in Ampex, and there's actually pictures, a couple tape machines there, John, somewhere, a pair of them.
Tape machines.
You showed it a couple minutes ago. And there. And he didn't like the way it sounded. Everybody thought, oh, gee, transistors, this is the new thing. We're not going to have to replace the tubes. It's going to not generate heat. It's going to be cheaper. It's going to be fantastic. And he put it in and said, I'm not feeling it. So he had a guy in Texas build him this machine, which is an Ampex transport, and 8 sets of tube electronics. It's a vacuum tube machine. And that's what he used to make those records. You see there's a stereo mixed down deck behind. And if you see the 4 knobs on the side, there's another 4 on the other side. That's the cell sync, the selective synchronization, where you could overdub if you wanted to.
And so you're hinting at it that they're on the threshold of distortion constantly on both sides of it, just under and just above it. And that's a beautiful part of how his vocal and the horns are so very expressive. And it seems to have relied on this tube-based tape machine as well as the console and the rest of the signal flow.
Mark, it's pretty safe to say that Sam Phillips had a great influence going forward on many audio engineers and continues to. How about Willie Mitchell? Is there something sort of obvious? Producers that came after that might have sort of latched on to his aesthetic and what he did with Al Green to inform other kinds of music, not necessarily even in that idiom, but people who were making records that were small and intimate and anechoic.
Absolutely. I mean, it was a great influence at the time. It continues to be. Not only do we have neo rockabilly from Sam, but we have all kinds of neo soul, and that those people are steeped in Al Green records and hip hop. I mean, in many cases, the Willie Mitchell's recordings are physically present in the hip hop records. The loops and stuff are derived from that sound. And one of the things that you get with sampling is it brings all the associations that people have with that. When I say intimacy, one of the things that's funny about being Al Green is when he'd go on tour and that sort of thing, people were constantly introducing him to babies who were conceived during the playing of his music. Talk about a legacy.
That's right. Are there places that you might suggest where we can read more about Willie Mitchell and get to know more of his legacy?
Did I mention I'm writing a book?
You should.
Oh, well, it's funny you should ask, John. I'm writing a book. It's a history of American recording studios in the 1960s and 70s. And it's a follow-up to Howard Massey's fantastic book called The Great British Recording Studios. And I'm writing this book. It's called The Great American Recording Studios. And in it, I get to tell a bunch of anecdotes and stories. So that's going to be a while because there's a lot of work to be done. But that would be one place. There's that internet thing that kids seem to be so excited about nowadays. There's a great book called Sweet Soul Music. Peter Guralnick and Robert Gordon are the two great chroniclers of Memphis history, and just about everything they've wrote. Just about everything they've written is worth looking at. There's a great book called "It Came from Memphis," which has music and non-musical stories that really relate to the uniqueness of that city. It's a fantastic place. When you go there, which I highly recommend. And I recommend going to Sun and going to the Rock and Soul Museum and going to the Stax Museum, where they rebuilt the demolished studio in place. There's something about that city, unlike, as I said earlier, unlike most places in America, it has a unique feel. The air is different, the vibe is different, the energy is different, and that's why so much incredible music has come from there.
There's a question from Facebook, which might be a nice way for us to wrap up this hour. But first, let me just apologize, Mark. We keep not letting you talk about Stax. We keep not letting you talk about Muscle Shoals. We really had to narrow the focus here. I look forward to the 6-hour version of this, or I guess I'll just wait for the book. Obviously, this is a rich and deep topic. But the question from Facebook asks if, and obviously it's something of a plant. We all know the answer, but maybe you can help us understand it. It's asking us if digital today can recreate the warmth of these records that we're talking about. We just tiptoed into the 70s, but we started in the 50s. is there anything we have to do special today to try to get back to the sound? Because digital is often thought of as a medium that doesn't distort nicely and that is too clinical, et cetera. So how do we avoid that with digital and learn from these records?
Well, digital is just is a mirror, and it's quite so. If you give it an interesting sounding sound, you'll get that sound back. I have to say, as a recording engineer, I don't miss tape machines as much as I might. So how can you get that sound? Well, think about the microphones and the microphone placement. And think about getting the sound from the microphones and the instruments rather than manipulating them later. Try to make decisions early on, as these people did, partly because they had to, but try to train yourself to do that sort of thing, I would say. There are many wonderful emulations of the vacuum tube circuitry and tape machines and all of that. All of that, can certainly work. And the other thing that I would say is to train your ears and mind by listening to a lot of this classic music. It's not just a museum piece. It's a fantastic source of inspiration and creativity and so forth. Secondly, a lot of music that people make these days is either similar to or pays homage to or draws from this music. So one thing that you would want to know is how are those recordings done in the first place, and then you can take it from there.
Well, thanks for helping us decode some of the many millions of small decisions that were made along the way by these talented people for making these records. John, is there any other things you want to cover before we sign off?
Well, I just want to say it's wonderful, Mark, to be a member of the Audio Engineering Society with you. It's been as educators, I think it's a great place to exchange thoughts about ideas like the music of Memphis, the recording styles of different producers, and I look forward to reading your book.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. I appreciate it very much, and thanks again for what you do.
Thanks, Mark.
It's a pleasure. Take care, guys.
We'll see you guys next Wednesday with the next AES edition.